Letter 5. On decolonialism. In September 1961, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. This handful of pages, 26 in the fifth volume of Situations, where they were republished in 1964, had the effect of a global earthquake. The year before this manifesto text was written, General de Gaulle had carried out a massive wave of decolonization in Africa, Dahomey, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, French Sudan, Mali, Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, Ubangishiri, Central African Republic, Middle Congo, Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Chad, Togo, Cameroon, and Madagascar became independent countries. But France was still at war with Algeria, which would become independent the following year, in 1962. Yet Sartre was less concerned with what had already been done than with playing his own hand, hijacking current events in a showdown with the French Communist Party. Sartre did not mince words. He opted for the most nihilistic radicalism. He called for bloodshed without restraint. Since this is a political matter, it is worth examining Sartre's political trajectory. In the 1930s, he showed no interest in politics. He saw nothing wrong, for example, in spending the summer of 1933 vacationing in Rome thanks to discounted train fares offered by Mussolini's fascist regime, on the condition that travelers attend an exhibition extolling the regime's virtues. Beauvoir and Sartre took the tickets, went to Rome, visited the exhibition, and enjoyed Italy. In the long letters he sent during this trip, not a word was spoken against the Duce's regime. In 1936, he did not vote for the Popular Front. During the war, Sartre staged his plays, which German censors had no issue with, and for good reason. Their content, contrary to what was later widely claimed, was not an act of resistance. Writing about ontological freedom and declaring it absolute posed no problem for the occupation authorities, who had abolished political freedoms. Hence the infamous sentence Sartre wrote in Les Lettres Françaises in September 1944. Never were we more free than under the German occupation. Sartre contributed articles to the collaborationist newspaper Comoedia in 1941, 1943, and 1944. In 1943, that paper named him Author of the Year. He published Being and Nothingness, a celebration of ontological freedom to which the German occupiers also took no offense. In 1944, he pulled strings to get Simone de Beauvoir a job at Radio Vichy, the regime's radio station, which aired violently anti-Semitic broadcasts just weeks before the Allied landings. After the war, Simone de Beauvoir crafted the couple's legend in her memoirs, especially The Prime of Life, 1960, and Force of Circumstance, 1963. They were said to have been in the resistance. But Sartre had no qualms about taking the place of a professor dismissed from the Condorcet Preparatory School for being Jewish, nor about signing a form declaring that he himself was neither Jewish nor a Freemason, though that didn't stop him from later scolding Beauvoir for having signed the same document. He supposedly wrote a draft constitution for post-war France and sent it to de Gaulle, though of course no trace of it has ever been found. It's hard to imagine de Gaulle, who respected writers, especially those concerned with France, never mentioning it. Beauvoir was said to have been expelled from the national education system by the Vichy regime for resisting it. In reality, she was dismissed for sleeping with a student. Sartre was said to have escaped from the prisoner of war camp by walking out an inexplicably open door. More likely, Pierre Drew La Rochelle, a notorious collaborator and director of Line RF, pulled strings for his release. After the war, Sartre joined purge committees to vouch for his publisher, who had published collaborationist authors. The publisher returned the favor by vouching for Sartre in turn. With rare exceptions, communists, loyal to Moscow and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, collaborated with the occupiers until Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler unilaterally broke the pact on June 22, 1941. The purge process avoided confronting these 2 years of collaboration, arguing they were followed by 2 years of resistance. The post-war Communist Party succeeded in erasing this indelible stain on its red banner, and through aggressive propaganda, managed to portray itself as the party of the resistance and the 75,000 executed, when in fact there were around 500, and not all were communists. From the immediate post-war period until 1956, Sartre conveniently became a fellow traveler of the Communist Party, which then commanded a quarter of the French electorate. He was a Marxist and met with many Marxist-Leninist dictators across the globe: Khrushchev, Castro, Che Guevara, Tito, and a Chinese minister under Mao. Just as during the occupation, the Communist Party's stance on Algeria was far from the heroic image usually presented. In 1945, when Algerians celebrated the liberation in Sétif and Guelma with ululations and their national flags, a gunfight broke out. A terrible crackdown followed, leaving dozens dead, some say hundreds, even thousands. The newspaper Luminite branded the massacred demonstrators as Hitlero-Trotskyists. In 1954, the Communists condemned FLN attacks and expelled party members who supported them. 2 years later, in 1956, they voted to grant special powers to the socialist government, enabling the military to use all means, torture included, to achieve its objectives. The Minister of Justice at the time was François Mitterrand. In 1961, a group of intellectuals wrote the Manifesto of the 121, calling for draft resistance, an end to the war, and support for FLN militants. The Communist Party was not among them. Sartre and Beauvoir were. The Communists rejected the initiative. The party only aligned itself with the Algerian nationalists in 1961, a few months before the Avion Accords. The party knew how to catch the train once it had already left the station. Under Maurice Thérèse, it had opposed abortion, contraception, and homosexuality. Under Georges Marchais, it was against immigration. Today, it presents itself as the party of the resistance, feminism, and LGBT liberation. It was in this all-or-nothing context that Sartre wrote his text. He radicalized his stance, hoping the Communist Party would follow his lead. Against Jean Canapa, the PC's gray eminence and his former student at the Neuilly High School, Sartre aspired to be the intellectual whispering in the party's ear. But the PCF only listened to the commentary in Moscow. What does this famous preface to Fanon's book say? First and foremost, it reads like a good essay by a student from the École Normale Supérieure, one that, in order to keep the complexity and diversity of reality at a safe distance, resorts to rampant essentialization. This essentialization is compounded by a Manichaeism that wallows in the purest moralism, like one would say of a hard drug. On one side, then, we have the Europeans, the French, the Westerners, the whites, the metropolitans. On the other, the Africans, the Algerians, the Third World, the Maghribis, and the blacks. Of course, the former are on the side of evil, the villains. They exploit, they torture, they plunder, they massacre, they scorn, they are a gang, have committed a genocide, they are enemies of mankind. Pages 186 and 188. They embody inhumanity, Ibid. Unsurprisingly, the other side is the camp of the good. It's also a good Normalian essay because, with the appropriate rhetoric and proper sophistry, Sartre explains that colonialism involved the plundering of raw materials from the colonized countries for the benefit of the colonizing ones, and that, having benefited from it, everyone is therefore responsible, guilty, in short, to be thrown into the same bag. To dismantle this paralogism, it is enough to say that anyone who has ever sweetened their coffee with a lump of sugarcane from a colonized country is guilty, responsible, and thus assimilated to the colonizers. Drinking coffee from Madagascar or using sugar from Martinique makes one an enemy of mankind, a génocidaire, to use Sartre's words. No need to add a splash of rum on top of that, unless one wants to become an iconic génocidaire. Finally, it's a good Normalian essay because it can't resist using the classic three-part structure. Sartre's thesis is simple, even simplistic, like that of children in primary school who fight like ragpickers and, when separated, claim in their own defense. He started it, not me. Thesis: the first violence is that of the evil colonizers. They arrive in a place where everything is as beautiful and good as in a Rousseau-like fiction. They bring evil with them. They settle by shedding blood, appropriate the goods of the native peoples, plunder their wealth, enslave them, destroy their knowledge and cultures. And one cannot entirely dispute this reading, except by moderating the portrait of the country painted by philosophers, since Montaigne's essays on the cannibals or Diderot's supplement to Bougainville's voyage. Colonized countries were not paradises on earth. One only has to think of the blood spilled by the pre-Columbians. Antithesis. Nonviolence responds to this genealogical violence. Sartre believes tribal wars are distractions. They stem from an inability to direct violence toward the proper victims, the colonizers. This ignores ethnographic accounts reporting that tribal wars are the norm among primitive peoples who have never seen the shadow of a white man, let alone a colonizer. Driven by his hatred of whites, Sartre portrays wars between tribes as effects of colonialism when they are in fact part of the human condition, going back to the primitive hordes described by Darwin. Just as he makes a colossal blunder in treating tribal war as a product of colonialism, he also claims that oppressed peoples resort to the sacred myth, religion, dances, and trances to redirect their violence, as if the worldview of first peoples had waited for the arrival of colonizers to come into being. This is the flattest kind of Marxist vulgarization. War generated by property and capitalism. Does it not exist among all other animals since life began on this planet? And religion as the opium of a people once again oppressed by capitalism. Synthesis. First, the original violence imposed by colonizers in a world supposedly ignorant of all violence. What a foolish idea to think that before the colonizers arrived, the natives had never known violence. Then the non-violence of the colonized peoples who turned the violence inward, in the form of tribal wars or retreats in a magical thinking. And finally, the counter-violence of the people who liberate themselves. Where does this notion of counter-violence, central to Sartre's political philosophy, come from? From critique of dialectical reason. In the most abstruse phenomenological language, the philosopher there simply justifies what is playground jurisprudence. He started it. Frantz Fanon was enthralled by this book. He was truly possessed by this work, reading it, studying it, retelling it to others, while he was suffering from leukemia, lying on a mattress on the floor in a room in Algiers. Marx and Engels developed a theory of violence. In the Notebooks for an Ethics, Sartre envisioned the same project, according to which violence would be the midwife of history. This amounts to denying any progress achieved by other means. Sartre, philosopher, writer, novelist, music lover, prefers the club to speech, the bow to exchange, the guillotine to discussion, the rifle to dialogue, the shell to negotiation, the atomic bomb to diplomacy, terrorism to diplomacy. In a word, war over peace. It is in this context that one must understand this famous sentence, to be placed in the Algerian context. One must kill. Killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, doing away with both an oppressor and an oppressed at the same time. What remains is a dead man and a free man, page 183. In other words, killing a white man is freeing an Algerian. Sartre loves blood. He loves the terror during the French Revolution, and even declared in an issue of Actual from February 1973. The revolutionaries of 1793 probably didn't kill enough. He attacks Albert Camus when, in The Rebel, 1952, the latter denounces the gulags, the death camps, and the blood spilled by the Marxist-Leninist regime in the USSR, a regime that caused 100 million deaths. Sartre loves blood, but not all the time. He hates European values and gives a strange reason for his disgust. Our cherished values lose their wings. When you look closely, there's not a single one that isn't stained with blood, page 188. Our philosopher, it seems, has selective bloodlust. He only likes blood when it is shed in the name of Marxism-Leninism. Indeed, Sartre fights for the socialist revolution, not necessarily for liberation, and even less for freedom. Algeria is a pretext. His project? To fulfill nihilism, to destroy France, its values, its history, its civilization. The same goes for Europe. When it comes to Algeria, Sartre praises nationalism. It's the worst evil when it concerns France, but the best thing for Algeria. He delights in the idea of France's death, of Europe's death, of the West's and its values' death. To conclude, Sartre doubles his delight in seeing France perish with another pleasure, which he names involution, pages 189 to 190, a noun whose content he specifies a few lines later. It is our turn, step by step, to walk the path that leads to being natives. But to become full natives, our land would have to be occupied by the formerly colonized, and we would have to die of hunger. That won't happen. No, it's the fallen colonialism that possesses us. It is he who will soon ride us, senile and magnificent, page 191. Jean-Paul Sartre thus foresees what, in Renaud Camus' terms, an intellectual bogeyman in France, is called the Great Replacement. Sartre did not merely foresee it, he diagnosed it and rejoiced in it. Algeria won its independence with the Avion Accords on March 18, 1962. The country thus has behind it more than half a century of independence. What has it done with it? Clear-eyed on the matter, Simone de Beauvoir made a bitter assessment as early as 1972. And all said and done, after stating how disappointed she had been by the Cuban Revolution, alignment with Moscow, food shortages, repression, persecution of intellectuals and long-haired youth, attacks on culture, laws against idlers and parasites, harassment, arrests. She then adds, a disappointment of another kind was the one I felt about Algeria's evolution. Page 916. Certainly, she lays blame, predictably, on the past, presented as a burden, to explain why the socialism bringing prosperity that she and Sartre fought for never came. It's a well-worn tactic of the left, but not only the left, to justify its inability to govern and its talent for failure. It's always the fault of those who came before, the fault of the war and its million dead, including cadres lost in Maquis. But she forgets to mention that most were victims of scores settling among rival Algerian factions vying for control of the independence movement. The fault of the million Pieds Noirs who left, all portrayed as masters of the land. But she could have remembered that Camus' parents were also Pieds Noirs, and that his father was a farm worker and his mother a cleaning woman. Hardly classic evil capitalists, the fault, again, of widespread illiteracy caused by colonialism. But when France opened schools, Sartre accused it of genocide and crimes against humanity. So if, after 10 years of autonomy and independence, Algeria in 1972 was not thriving, it was because the French arrived in 1830. For a certified philosophy teacher, this reasoning seems rather flimsy. Beauvoir offers a snapshot of Algeria's decade from 1962 to 1972, massive unemployment within, massive emigration outward, exacerbated nationalism. But she also gives the reasons for this failure. The Algerian leaders did not implement socialism, but rather state capitalism. So it's the fault of capitalism, even though the regime was socialist. No collectivization of land, no self-management in factories. If hardline Marxism had been implemented, it would surely have brought prosperity. The author of The Second Sex also tackles the issue of women. She rightly links it to religion. Instead of trying to politicize the masses, they encourage them to return to Arab Islamic values, she writes. Were these values? Natalism, and thus the relegation of women to the role of mother. Education reduced to household economy, thus illiteracy and ignorance. Traditionalism, and thus the wearing of the veil, submission to the patriarchal order, and therefore to husband, father, brother, arranged marriages, and thus the father's authority over tribal alliance choices. Fanon believed that the establishment of socialism would abolish these Arab Islamic values, to use Beauvoir's phrase, but this has not happened. The history of the Algerian War has never truly been written. It has been the subject of a few activist publications, but without seriousness. In the absence of proper historical work, a hysterical version has prevailed. At the time when Beauvoir supports the FLN, she publishes in 1962 a book entitled Jamila Bapacha with Giselle Halimi. Jamila Bapacha is an FLN activist who planted a bomb at the Brasserie de Facultés in Algiers on September 27, 1959. According to her lawyer, Giselle Halimi, she did not carry out the attack but was preparing to. In reality, her bomb was defused in time by the Army's bomb disposal unit. If Jamila Bapacha did not kill, it is not for lack of trying, but thanks to the diligence of the French army, which prevented, just as in other attacks committed by the FLN, innocent people from dying simply because they happened to be there, drinking, eating ice cream, or having an aperitif with friends. On June 2, 1960, Simone de Beauvoir publishes an op-ed in Le Monde in support of this Algerian activist. Without delving into the historical details of this affair, let us examine the formation of the hysterical version that still prevails on both sides of the Mediterranean. First, a few facts. General de Gaulle has been in power since May 1958. He attempts to resolve the issue by proposing a referendum on August 30th so that Algerians can decide their fate. In response, the FLN multiplies acts of war. Then the head of state calls for a peace of the brave on October 23rd, which the FLN refuses. The civil war between MNA Algerians and FLN Algerians causes more than 4,000 Algerian deaths, for which the French army bears no responsibility. Already on May 28, 1957, the FLN had massacred over 300 Algerians living in Malouza, guilty of supporting the MNA, and tried to make it appear that the carnage was the work of the French army. On September 16, 1959, de Gaulle announces a referendum on self-determination. During all this time, faced with the political and diplomatic initiatives of General de Gaulle, all rejected by the nationalist belligerents, the war continues under the impetus of the special powers granted in March 1956 at the request of Guy Mollet's socialist government by the Socialists and the French Communist Party. Capital or summary executions are part of it, as well as the torture to which Jamila Bapacha was subjected. Next, a few myths. Simone de Beauvoir, who, along with Jean-Paul Sartre, spent the occupation far from any resistance activity, and not without some complacency toward the Nazi occupier, resorts to an effective polemical framework, but at the cost of a historical revisionism with terrible consequences. Just as Nazi Germany occupied France, and collaborators supported this invasion while resistors opposed it, Republican France colonized Algeria, and collaborators supported it in this colonial enterprise, white Judeo-Christian Europeans without distinction, while indigenous Arab-Muslim resistors opposed it. Thus, every Algerian living in the country since the 19th century becomes an agent of the white imperialism of the French state. True to their training at the École Normale, which they never renounced until the end of their lives, Sartre and Beauvoir essentialize indiscriminately. The white is always a colonizing occupier, the North African always a colonized victim. The former is bad, the latter good. One is evil, the other good. The white can do no good, even when doing good, because he is white. The Arab Muslim can do no wrong, even when doing wrong, because he is Arab Muslim. If the former seeks peace, he does evil. If the latter slits throats, decapitates, or plants bombs, he does good. In their plea for Jamila Bapacha, Beauvoir and Halimi apply the resistors/collaborators framework. From the first line, Beauvoir speaks of genocide, uses the expression extermination camps, writes Night and Fog, invokes the Warsaw Ghetto, and Frank mentions the Gestapo and transforms the prison guard into a capo. The thesis is clear. France is behaving in Algeria like the Nazi occupier in France. One could legitimately ask Simone de Beauvoir a series of questions. Where in Algeria can one see the endless convoys methodically transporting the condemned to gas chambers? In which part of the country are there extermination camps, with barbed wire and watchtowers, guards and German shepherds, where executions are carried out using Zyklon B? Which manufacturer supplies the French army with crematoria? Where can one see chimneys spewing flames and ashes, fed by incinerated corpses? Who has seen roundups in the streets to capture marked populations, including children, wearing the equivalent of a yellow star. What is the name of the Algerian city whose neighborhood was burned down, inhabitants included, like in Warsaw? Can anyone name the Algerian in Franc? Let's stop here. Popular wisdom says, comparison is not reason. But at the École Normale Supérieure, common sense is not the most widely shared thing in the world. It's understandable that having missed out on history for so long, fascism in Italy, the Popular Front, the rise of dangers, National Socialism in Germany, Munich, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact endorsed by Sartre, the occupation in France, the monumental failure of the resistance in Paris. The Thénardiers of philosophy would want to restore their health with a few grand speeches. With this rhetorical and sophistic artifice, using this academic paralogism, French in Algeria equals Nazis in France during the occupation. Sartre and Beauvoir managed to pass for resistance fighters with a 20-year delay, waging their war from Café de Flore or Les Deux Magots. Thus they fed their legend, but at the cost of a legendary history for which France is still paying the price, what I call the hysterical rather than historical version of events. January 2012, I'm preparing a book on Albert Camus, more specifically on the libertarian politics of Albert Camus. I'm in Algiers, tracing the steps of the philosopher, his childhood home, his school, his lycée, the streets of the city, his father and mother, the people, the ghost of his schoolteacher, Mr. Germain, and his philosophy professor, Jean Grenier, the smells, the sky, the odysseys seen nowhere and wrecked cars everywhere, the old colonial buildings, once white, now turned gray, dirty, black, the kindness of people who greet me or speak to me after recognizing me. They watch French TV programs. Algiers stretches for kilometers along the coast. You can't find a single restaurant to eat a grilled fish, let alone accompany it with a bottle of chilled white wine. The pool Camus used to go to is filled with sand and dust, filth and grime. The few usable meters of beach are blocked off with massive stone blocks. In Tipesa, I arrived trembling with emotion in the Roman ruins, with their asphodels and olive trees, their eternal sky and sun. I want to see here the Mediterranean from which nuptials, with its sublime pages, once emerged like a poetic and philosophical fish of fire. Words by Camus are engraved on a simple, sober steel. They were hammered with stones, hammered to be mutilated. It was the philosopher's skull that was beaten with those rocks, his thought that was stoned, his soul that is still being attacked. It is unlikely the Vandal had read Misery in Kabylia, a series of reports written in June 1939. He would have discovered Camus' love for the Algerian people, to whom he belonged. He would also have discovered the unflinching criticism of colonial policies decided in Paris against the Algerians. There is no greater lover of Algeria than Camus, who did everything he could to prevent it from tearing itself apart. But Algeria has been Sartrean since Sartre used it for his own cause. It sadly still is, as it was a Sartrean hand that defaced Camus' commemorative steel. In the early evening, in my hotel room, I watched the news in stunned disbelief. The set design, even the presenter's outfit, gives the impression of a 1970s broadcast in France. But the worst part is that, politically, the broadcast seems frozen in time. It addresses Algerians as if the Algerian War had never ended. France is still and always portrayed as an active colonial power, responsible for everything that goes wrong in this country that has been independent for exactly 50 years. It seems to me that after half a century of independence, it takes some nerve to keep blaming the colonists of 1830 and their descendants up to 2012, when the current rulers have been in charge for 50 years. At dinner, where the friends accompanying me on this journey and I had been invited by fussy authorities, we were received by a hostess whose dress looks like the princess outfits once given to little girls for Christmas. A man with a completely shaved head seems to be a husband or friend. In fact, he was a lover. A portly individual is introduced as a journalist who plays the oud. A stream of staff brings a series of dishes: appetizers, couscous, desserts. We are asked how we found Algeria. I recount the trip from Algiers to Tipesa and express my surprise at the incredible number of security checks at the hotel entrance or exit, and also on the roads regularly slashed by spike strips. The Yellbrenner lookalike takes it badly and invokes our safety. Barbie doll picks a matching smile. The fat journalist pants, sweats, and plays harder. We soon shorten the evening as politely as possible. Egghead was a high-ranking military man, his mistress the deus ex machina in charge of authorizing commercial and industrial projects in the country. The journalist, a journalist. The army, industry, commerce, business, and the press were thus gathered in that room, as they are across the whole of Algeria, as they were at that evening newscast where the channel's director, editors-in-chief, and journalists spoke of the FLN the way North Korean TV speaks of Kim Jong-un. The country is thus in the hands of a mafia that has confiscated its wealth, gas, oil, mineral resources, industry, commerce, and shares the considerable profits among itself. The people are now dispossessed of the nation's resources, which end up in the bank accounts of a few families that have brought the country under their control. A certain business-minded Islam, born out of the Civil War, which claimed 500,000 lives without a single one being the victim of a French hand, collaborates. The people suffer. If we are to believe the relentless flood of state propaganda, France is genocidal, it employed Adolf Hitler's techniques, and it committed a crime against humanity. This even President Macron now acknowledges. But then, why has President Bouteflika been receiving treatment for his stomach cancer for years at the Val de Grace Hospital in Paris? Can one imagine General de Gaulle consulting a Nazi urologist in a Berlin hospital in 1943? Or bin Laden treating his prostate at a Washington clinic in 2010? A choice must be made. Either France committed a crime against humanity in Algeria, in which case President Bouteflika should have sought treatment in an Algerian hospital, or he chose a French facility because there is not a single competent one in the Algeria that the FLN has ruled with an iron fist since 1962, in which case the supposed crime against humanity must be reconsidered. Neither France, wholly devoted to its nihilistic religion of repentance, contrition, and remorse, nor Algeria, trapped in its victimhood complex and tearful tendency, is capable of approaching the history of this period like adults. As long as the hysterical version prevails, the historical version will have no voice. Where moralizing reigns, genealogy is silenced. Moreover, populations of Algerian origin living in France have not been educated in history, but rather fed the propaganda endlessly broadcast by Algerian state television. Through satellite dishes and now digital connections, they are indoctrinated by the power of the FLN. In the press freedom rankings by Reporters Without Borders, Algeria ranks 146th out of 180. How could young people from the suburbs love France if their only image of it is what the Algerian state's media says? How can a people raised on the rotten milk of a totalitarian regime reflect on their history in order to put an end to a war that will not end as long as a French head of state prefers moralizing over genealogy? How can souls lost by the Republic, which has taught nihilism for decades, not find in the global Ummah a source to forge an identity in radical opposition to a France whose self-hatred is its main driving force? Reading Houria Boutelja's books offers a window into the mind of part of this young Franco-Algerian generation. Houria Boutelja published a book titled Les Blancs, Les Juifs et nous, a title that is in itself a whole program. It amounts to a fascist manifesto, provided we give that word its true meaning and not merely use it as an insult. I call fascism a doctrine that clearly resorts to violence and terror to assert itself, that is anti-Semitic, phallocratic and misogynistic, homophobic and anti-democratic, colonialist and imperialist, concerned with creating a new man, inspired by a mystique anchored in transcendence. One also notes, of course, the use of totalitarian language, as defined by Victor Klemperer in his book on the Third Reich. Let us examine Boutelja's work through this lens. It is plainly stated, this new fascism explicitly supports the theory of the Great Replacement. This theory originates with Renaud, Camus, who claims that Judeo-Christian civilization is disappearing under the impact of mass immigration that tends to Islamize Europe. In a 2010 book bearing that title, Renaud Camus revived a conclusion once used in far-right circles in the 19th century. This man is one of the cursed authors in France. He is the devil. In the cultural world, which endlessly recites the politically correct catechism of the American left, this theory is labeled conspiracist, fascist, anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic, etc. So be it. But when expressed by someone who presents herself as an indigenous of the Republic, page 25, it arouses no condemnation among right-thinking circles. On the contrary, it is validated, celebrated, encouraged, praised. Consider this. France will never again be like in Fernando's films. Our presence on French soil Africanizes, Arabizes, Berberizes, Creolizes, Islamizes, blackenizes the eldest daughter of the church, once white and immaculate, as surely as the ebb and flow of waves polish and repolish blocks of granite with pretensions to eternity. We are transforming France. In other words, she is integrating into us. In other words, we are participating in the construction of the identity norm and thus in the questioning of the Republican Pact, which is also a national racial pact, page 112. Further on, she speaks of her civilizing mission, which consists in preparing the great replacement, the human in place of the white, the human in place of the black, page 122. Great replacement is the term she uses, and the italics are hers. Huria Boutelja frequently uses capital letters. The white and the black are the active categories of her Manichaeism. There's also the indigenous, the social race. The white is always a bastard, a colonizer, a culprit, a torturer, a tyrant, a butcher, a genocidaire, a predator, whatever he does, even when he carries the FLN suitcases, since they are only ever his own. Shoot Sartre, writes the author, not without wielding paradox, if not being wielded by it. The black is always a hero, a victim, a martyr, a prey, even when he plants a bomb in a public place. Above all sick, I am a victim, she writes. She celebrates the very beautiful beauty of the black man that was Malcolm X, and, without mentioning, of course, that he was bisexual, nor that this Muslim was assassinated by his own people, she states, Malcolm X, who became Malek el-Shabazz, was killed because he was beautiful, page 135. According to this logic, one might infer that if the black man is beautiful because he is black, the white man is ugly because he is white. There is no difference between the white man living in the digital age and the one from 1492. They are one and the same. Nothing has happened since the conquests of Christopher Columbus. Victor Schulcher, who obtained the abolition of slavery. A white man acting like a noble soul. Sartre, who calls for carrying the FLN suitcases. A white man driven by his well-meaning philo-Semitic conscience. But Frantz, Fanon, or Malcolm X, because they are black, are heroes who unleash the author's stylistic lyricism. They tell us 1789. Let's respond 1492. Page 116. 1492 is the date of original sin, which nothing will erase except the spilled blood of the white man, according to Frantz Fanon's call to violence, encouraged by Jean-Paul Sartre. She loves Jean Genet because he confesses his guilt and his desire to be absolved by those who promise him black violence and brutality. This man built a career on his imprisonment for petty theft. He has always declared his hatred of France, his delight at its invasion in 1940, his sexual fondness for the handsome German officer. Who, truly, is Jean Genet, who seems to be the only author not deserving of Huria Boutelja's vindictiveness, which she calls love? A leftist token who, nevertheless, wrote in Funeral Rites in 1944 a eulogy of the SS, a praise of Hitler, a celebration of the milice. In The Criminal Child, 1949, the same Genet ecstatically lingers, with disturbing pleasure, over the tanned and tattooed skins with which the Nazis made lampshades. In Prisoner of Love, 1986, he claims that Hitler is not guilty of having burned or had Jews burned before asserting that the Jews used the Shoah to justify their Zionist, colonialist, criminal policies, which is also Huria Butelja's thesis. For her, Hitler is indeed an epiphenomenon. To be better understood, she writes, for the South, the Shoah is, if I dare say, less than a detail. It's not even in the rearview mirror. This history is not truly mine, and I will keep it at a distance as long as the history and life of the wretched of the earth also remain a detail, page 55. She explicitly echoes Jean-Marie Le Pen, who, as we recall, called the Holocaust a detail of World War II history. That statement forever tainted Jean-Marie Le Pen's life, but it's considered a mark of intellectual seriousness by the indigenes de la République. If one wants to claim that Hitler is a trivial matter, the Shoah an anecdote, anti-Semitism a trifle, the gas chambers mere footnotes, and National Socialism a bagatelle, one had better be black, in Huria Butelja's terms. One just needs to say it's not their story, as if one could shop in history, picking what matters. The slave trade, unless one notes that it was initiated by Muslims and lasted longer than that of the whites, and rejecting what doesn't, such as the final solution. It is within this framework, like in totalitarian regimes, that Huria Butelja invites us to subject history to ideology. There is no longer truth, only interpretations, borrowing from a falsely Nietzschean commonplace, which I deconstructed in the first letter. There would thus be one history for the South, another capitalized idol, and another for the North, never named but clearly the land of the whites. She writes that we must challenge their version of history, as if the existence of the gas chamber were merely a version. This historical revisionism is clearly defined to rewrite sick history, to denationalize it, to deracialize it, page 46. Patrick Boucheron, professor at the Collège de France, along with a team of 100 historians, has taken up this task in his Global History of France, in which France is nothing without those who colonize, humiliate, scorn, or deny it. This Global History of France, which from 1940 to 2015 devotes no chapter to de Gaulle, finds it relevant to include one on the Dominique Strauss-Kahn affair. This writing that claims to deracialize history, of course, spends all its time racializing. But to sustain a racist discourse, one must rely on a few sophisms and paralogisms. First, this rhetoric essentializes one color into a systematically negative sign, whites, while another, blacks, is positively connoted. A white man supports the abolition of slavery. He's a bastard trying to cleanse his conscience, which is why, in May 2020, Martinique and decolonialists vandalized the statue of Victor's sculpture despite, or rather, because he helped abolish slavery and now demand the renaming of the library bearing his name. A black man commits a terrorist attack? Since Huria Butelja calls terrorism, page 15, the weapon of the poor, he is a hero advancing the cause of freedom. The white man of 2020 committed an unpardonable sin in 1492, but Mohammed Merah, who shot Jewish children point-blank in the head, is a victim of the colonial white regime that determined his behavior. The victim was not the Jewish child lying in his own blood, but his killer. Then, another trick. Invoking the concept of the racialized, a racialized person has the right, indeed the duty, to be racist because this is authorized by the fact that their ancestors were victims of racial persecution. There is no need even to have been a victim oneself. It suffices to be a descendant. According to Freud's theory of phylogenetic transmission of trauma, a school of psychoanalysis claims that the suffering experienced in 1492 still has effects today as you read these lines. These believers in magical thinking add a veneer of scientific legitimacy by asserting that cells in the germplasm retain the memory of such torment, and that this unconscious memory determines contemporary behavior. This is how and why a white person who has never committed a single racist act will still be considered racist, whereas a black person who commits one against a white person cannot be called racist and will instead be described as a hero who, by attacking the integrity or life of a white person, affirms the power of liberation for himself and for others. Thank you, Jean-Paul Sartre. The word racialized is a semantic invention of war that authorizes racism by black people. I use the author's categories against whites because it is said the aggressor does not resort to violence, but to counterviolence, as theorized in Critique of Dialectical Reason. This same word also supports the denial of anti-white racism, since, according to the same principles, a racist black person is not racist because they are racialized, while non-racist, even anti-racist, white person is racist because they are not racialized. This false dialectic, a real shell game, legitimizes black racism against whites among decolonialists and their supporters. That is why Huria Butelja can write, "Between whites and us there is race," page 115, without incurring condemnation. A white person divides the world in a black and white. Racism. A black person can use the word race. It is necessary to explain that whites are ontologically an inferior race marked by evil. If a white person does the same, they are brought to court and risk being convicted of racism. Judges need only quote whites, Jews, and us. Racial hatred, isn't that a white feeling? Page 137. The sentence is cleverly phrased as a rhetorical question, avoiding direct condemnation. Imagine what would happen to a white person who wrote, "Between blacks and us there is race." This form of racism, which presupposes the existence of inferior races, whites, and superior ones, blacks, comes with a regime of racial segregation. No problem. Huria Butelja revives the Muslim notion of dhimmitud. What is it? In Islamic law, it refers to a non-Muslim who, under a Sharia regime, is subject to a number of obligations and clearly becomes a second-class citizen. Among various prohibitions, one finds a ban on riding a horse. Only donkeys are allowed, and even then, only side saddle like women. Impure, the dhimmi is required to pay a submission tax, where distinctive clothing or a badge, for example, in Baghdad, a yellow insignia for Jews. Huria Butelja, speaking of dhimmitud, writes, "It's true, the dhimmi status was inferior to that of the dominant group. It governed pre-modern societies. It would be anachronistic to judge it, as you are already tempted to do, through modern-day lenses. So don't try to escape that way." Page 52. Funny how the invocation of history and calls for contextualization reappear when it suits someone who claims we're still living in the year 1492 of the Christian era. Now, this tax was collected over the past 10 years in several Muslim countries, by the Pakistani Taliban from the Sikhs, by the Muslim Brotherhood from Coptic Christians in Egypt, by the Islamic State from Christians in Syria and Iraq. There is no reason to think that, in the case of the Great Replacement so fervently desired by Huria Butelja, this couldn't become a reality in France or Europe. In such a context, why forego the Quranic law backed by many surahs that teach the superiority of Muslims over other communities? For example, this verse where Allah addresses his followers, "You are the best community ever raised among mankind." 3:110. A verse one might compare to this striking line from Huria Butelja. "Being part of the master race is everyone's thrill." Page 53. It is clear this sentence alludes to the chosen people and therefore raises the Jewish question. With her habit of downplaying the Holocaust, asserting that Hitler is not part of the history of the Global South and is thus a negligible historical figure, citing Dudon approvingly, page 68, admitting that Ahmadinejad, who wanted to wipe Israel off the map, is her hero, page 32, praising Jean Genet, whose fondness for the SS and the milice we've seen, or writing, "You are not the true chosen people," page 50, implying with those quotation marks that the true chosen people are Muslims, a claim found in the Quran. Huria Butelja does not hide her agenda. Her thesis is simple. Jews are acceptable only if they reconnect with their Arab origin, thus black, in the author's all-purpose terminology. If they embrace the Palestinian cause, they are acceptable. In other words, if they contribute to their own annihilation, they deserve to exist. But if they oppose the Palestinians, then they are white and deserve only the contempt reserved for that race. Heads, Jews disappear by negating themselves. Tails, they must disappear because they embody white power in the Arab world, Zionist and capitalist colonialism. Either way, they must disappear. Of course, she rejects the idea that anti-Zionism is the contemporary form of anti-Semitism. But how can one believe her when Hitler, Janet, Ahmadinejad, or Dieudan are presented by her as comrades in the struggle, fellow travelers? In her decolonial reading of the Nazi genocide, page 58, the destruction of the Jews is declared negligible compared to the tropical genocides, page 59, that preceded it. In the historical revisionism she proposes, Hitler is merely a small-time player compared to the victims of colonialism. I will not go to Auschwitz, she writes, page 55, and one understands why. She would see gas chambers and crematoria that were used to deliberately exterminate an entire people, whereas colonialism supposedly had no interest in burning the slaves essential to its trade. To claim that slavery, which, let be clear, is indefensible, is a variation on genocide is a paralogism, not to say something worse. But it has the advantage of enabling the emergence of a tropical negationism. The portrait of the decolonial fascist takes shape. He pits whites, ontologically evil, against kind blacks. He rejoices in the disappearance of the former and in their great replacement by the latter. He claims that even when he has done nothing, the white man is guilty, and that when he has committed a crime or a rape, the black man is a victim of colonial violence by whites. He freezes the historical clock in 1492, asserting that this past is our present for eternity. He downplays the final solution and praises those who think likewise. Janet, Dieudan, Ahmadinejad. He rewrites history to make his mythologies triumph, because Western reason is white and Descartes is the father of white ferocity, page 26. He believes there is a superior race, the black one, and that the white race must be eliminated. He legitimizes dimitude, in other words, the hierarchy between Muslim lords and Jewish or Christian slaves. He invents a new form of anti-Semitism through the Arabization of Jews, meaning their conversion to Islam. He also shapes a tropical version of Holocaust denial. To complete this portrait, let us examine the issue of women and that strange conceptual edifice of feminism, patriarchal, misogynistic, and phallocentric. This intellectual feat allows for the reactivation of the Nazi logic of the three Ks: Kinder, Kush, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Simone de Beauvoir's feminism is not acceptable. It is, after all, that of a white woman, and skin color trumps all. A white person speaks poorly, thinks wrongly, does not reflect because only the black person speaks well, thinks rightly, and reflects. Even when he says nothing, thinks nothing, and reflects not at all. Therefore, The Second Sex is a sexist, colonialist, capitalist book. It is a product of white patriarchy. By inverting the false values of false feminism, one obtains the true values of a true feminism. And abracadabra, this new anti-white feminism teaches submission to men, the father, the brothers, the husband, the cousins. Quite a thought, though I'm not sure that last verb fits. The master concept of Huria Batelge's thought is her father's mustache. It is this tuft of hair that lays down the law. It is this that makes her write, "My body does not belong to me," and to add, "No moral authority will make me take on a slogan conceived by and for white feminists," page 71. Let be known, Simone de Beauvoir is a white man, defender of colonialism, capitalism, and Western patriarchy. Patriarchy is thus not the problem, because the problem is white patriarchy. If it is not white, but black, patriarchy becomes the most beautiful thing in the world. Better a macho black man than a feminist white one. This is what allows a decolonialist like Rokhaya Diallo to write in France, "Love it or shut up," that the 500 women sexually assaulted on the night of December 31st, 2015 in Germany by migrants are, like their assailants, victims of white colonialism that put them in a position where they had to become rapists. Reporting the facts, in this case the ethnic and geographic origins of the attackers, page 163, is de facto behaving like a racist. Those who write whites, blacks, Jews with capital letters are accused of essentializing Arabo-Muslims. Suddenly, when these activists see fit, they no longer wish to essentialize. 500 trees no longer make a forest. That a 2020 anti-racist white person is deemed racist because in 1492 whites colonized the Americas is intellectually acceptable, but that the Arab Muslim community should not be held accountable when, in the present, hundreds of its members rape women is intellectually unacceptable. Rokhaya Diallo does not hesitate to write about Cologne. No mitigating circumstances, no excuses, no circumlocution, no yes, but all forms of sexism are intolerable and must be punished. However, we regret the turn the debate has taken. So, no, but however is admissible. Indeed, decolonialists are never short on paralogisms. The problem, then, is not this massive, collective rape by an Arab Muslim population, to use once again the author's own categories, but the political exploitation by those who said that reality indeed took place. If a white person says there was a rape, then there is no reason to speak of rape. In a gang rape committed by blacks, categories branded by decolonialism, I repeat, the problem is not the rape, nor the blacks, but what whites say when they claim that a gang rape was committed by blacks. Let us never forget that when they do something wrong, blacks are always victims of whites, who have the monopoly on evil and who taught it to them. It is written in their blood, their genes, the fault is transmitted through the white body. Let us put it allegorically. White sperm is black, black sperm is white. Huria Butelja recounts an initiatory sexual mutilation inflicted upon her. She would rather say gifted to her to express all the good she thinks of it. It is the signature of what she presents as black feminism. One may infer that excision or infibulation also contribute to the definition of this black feminism. Her thigh is slashed 3 times with a razor. The blood flows. Coal is applied to help it heal. It is a patriarchal right that seizes your body, that chains it to the lineage of the ancestors. My paternal grandmother approves. I belong to her. My maternal grandmother approves. I belong to her. My grandfathers, fallen as martyrs, approve. I belong to them. My father approves. I belong to him. My mother, there's no need to even mention it. She's the one who put the handcuffs on me. I belong to her. The blood has dried. The scar will be indelible. And then this, I belong to my family, to my clan, to my neighborhood, to my race, to Algeria, to Islam. I belong to my history, and, God willing, I belong to my descendants. Pages 71 to 72. Should we point out that the word France appears nowhere? The body of this feminism is the body as willed by the Quran. That is why the issue of homosexuality is not addressed as a historical, sociological, or political question, but as an ideological one. Huria Butelja denounces the coming out of Muslim homosexuals. For her, it is an occasion for the jubilation of white people. And that's just too much. The homosexual who defies the taboo of homophobic Islam. The Quran calls homosexuality an abomination and a perversion, 3:80 to 81, and says homosexuals must be driven out of the city, is a 2-bit hero, page 80. Let us continue the demonstration. When white people rejoice over the coming out of the indigenous male, it is both due to homophobia and racism. As everyone knows, a faggot is not quite a man, and thus the Arab who loses his virile power is no longer a man. And that is good. It's even really good. And besides, it's so reassuring, page 81. That is why in the suburbs, misogyny, phallocracy, and homophobia are exaggeratedly performed. It becomes obvious that a homophobic Muslim is once again merely a poor victim of colonial and capitalist white virilism. If the insult, fuck your mother, is a conceptual must among black people, it's Simone de Beauvoir's fault, mired in her whiteness. Interpret that as you will. Huria Butelja therefore analyzes this white indulgence toward the gay Muslim. It supposedly stems from a disarming of one of their fears, the fearsome and insolent Islamic virility, page 81. the kind that spills over in Cologne and Hamburg on New Year's Eve? Since the argument is fit for a schoolyard, let's phrase it accordingly. The white man has a small dick. He can't handle the big ones Muslims have. Such an argument, if spoken by a white person, would result in prosecution. Let's recall that for the rapes committed by Arab Muslims in Germany, the outcome of the Hamburg trial was clear: acquittals and condemnations of the police for procedural errors. Did the judges read Whites, Jews, and Us, where the author explains that rapists are men diminished by whites who can only reclaim their dignity through the use of violence? Page 94. So, when a black man rapes, it is a white man who should be decapitated. The judges clearly understood the lesson. It will not have escaped anyone that the body of decolonial feminism is the body of the Quran. Huria Batelja is against atheism, page 127, against secularism, which she portrays as collective impiety, against white reason, page 128, and Western rationalism, but in favor of Islam, which is a wisdom that is perfectly rational and acceptable by all, page 132. Rational in quotation marks. The devil is in the details, and one would truly have liked to know why. Who are the targets of decolonialism in general and Huria Batelja in particular? Democracy, debate, the French Revolution, secularism, rationalism, Christianity and Judaism, humanism, the Republic, Philosemitism, human rights, France and its history, universalist feminism, integration, and modernity. Were the ideals of decolonialism in general and Huria Batelja in particular: anti-Zionism, dimitude, anti-white racism, terrorist violence, page 15, Sharia, but also sexual mutilation, the Great Replacement, homophobia, misogyny, patriarchy, philocracy, so long as it's under the flag of Islam, and without irony, love, peace, feminism, and respect. Huria Batelja, who coined the noun Souchons to refer to native French people, so they do exist, writes, "I'm not from here. I am not from here. It was destiny that pushed me here," page 105. She then speaks of the tortures of exile. She was born on January 5, 1973, in Constantine, Algeria. She studied in Lyon and is now employed at the Institut du Monde Arabe. There is, for her, a simple way to end these tortures of exile. She could flee this so detestable France and return to her country of birth. These tortures must be quite mild if they can be escaped at will. Ah yes, one last word. Huria Batelja is also antifascist and, of course, a resistant, page 47. Proof? She fights against the Rassemblement National,